Since taking office in 2023, the coalition government has rolled out a sweeping program of tough on crime policies, increasing sentences, expanding police powers, building more prison beds, even tasking police with moving rough sleepers off the streets. And now it's election year again, and like clockwork, the parties of the right are banging the law and order drum again. If you took their political press releases and social media feeds as a guide to reality, you could be forgiven for thinking that New Zealand was overrun with violence, gangs, and disorder. And many people are buying this. Since the early 2000s, public surveys consistently show that most New Zealanders believe that crime is increasing. But the problem is, it isn't. The truth is that crime in New Zealand is falling, and it has been for decades. And yet, since the 1980s, at the same time as crime has been falling, an increasingly punitive approach to criminal justice has taken hold, with crime coming to dominate the news headlines and politicians competing over who can be the most tough on crime. The consequence has been that New Zealand's rate of imprisonment has doubled since the 1980s. We now imprison people at one of the highest rates in the developed world, and Māori are grossly overrepresented. So how did we get to this point? Why is there such a huge gap between our common understanding of the criminal justice system and the reality of it? What are the forces really driving people through our courts and into our prisons? And who really benefits from tough on crime politics? Kia ora koutou, you're listening to Undercurrents, a show brought to you by Public Interest. My name is Ollie Neas. And today we're talking law and order. Joining me for this conversation is a returning guest to the show, Gabriella Brayne. Gabriella is a lawyer in Tamaki Makaurau who's been involved in advocacy around prison reform and criminal justice issues. Alongside Gabriella, I'm pleased to welcome Asher Emanuel, the author of the new book, The Valley, published by Bridget Williams Books, which has attracted widespread acclaim since its release in May for its extraordinary depiction of the day-to-day reality of our criminal justice system. Asher also works as a lawyer himself. Asher and Gabriella, welcome to the show. Now, I want to start by talking about the book, The Valley, Asher. In a sense, it's a very easy book to describe. It's a book about the criminal justice system. It's following three people through the system. But in another sense, it's incredibly difficult to capture in a few sentences because you spent 8 years writing it. It follows these three people, Nathan, Rikihana and Lewis. Two of them are defendants, one's a lawyer, through courtrooms, into WINS offices, into boarding houses over an 18-month period. But the origin of the book gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. Can you take us back to 2018 when you started the project and tell us a little bit about what was going on then and what prompted you to start on this project?
Well, I'd been working in a court as my first job after law school, and I think when you work in the criminal justice system, it becomes apparent that there's information and knowledge about how it works and the reality of it that is totally familiar to people who go through the system, but which isn't really reflected in the public understanding of it, and it doesn't make it out through news media, which tends to focus on the most sensational crimes, things which are mysterious or terrifying. Because these things in the content economy attract the most attention. And what that means is that there's a sort of a way in which news media systematically is unable to capture the reality of life in the criminal justice system. And in that gap, I saw a story, but it seemed to me that in order to tell the story, it was important to tell it through the stories of people who go through the system. And so I set out to find those people and report their stories. And that was just about 8 years ago now.
Well, let's talk about those people that you did choose to follow in the Valley. So there's three key figures in the book. There's Nathan Morley, who finds himself regularly in front of the courts, mainly for burglary charges. Then there's Rikihana Wallace, whose primary issue is shoplifting. And then the third character you follow is their legal aid lawyer, Lewis Skerritt. But those were just a small number of many people that you talked to for the purposes of this book. What led you to focus on those three people specifically? Or what about their lives seemed emblematic to you of the broader issues that you were interested in?
Yeah, I met many, many people in the course of the research. And as you say, these were just a few of them. It was towards the end of the research that it became apparent to me that the book was going to be about the three of them. And at the level of the story, they were closely connected to one another. Nathan and Rikihana knew each other from being neighbours and also knew each other from times that they're in prison together. And the three of them, including Lewis, all were born and grew up in the Hutt Valley. And so there was a sense in which the trio of them were figures of, I guess, like our generation, born late 80s, early 90s, at a time of very significant political upheaval in New Zealand and the final breakdown, I guess, of the sort of social democratic compromise of the late part of the 20th century, and big changes that were happening in the criminal justice system. And so when Nathan's born in 87, the prison population is in the low thousands. And 30 odd years later, when he's in custody at Umutaka prison, at the beginning of the story in the book, the prison population has nearly quadrupled and the rate of imprisonment has doubled. And so there were massive political, economic and policy changes which took place over the course of their lives. And so both at the level of their individual stories, but also the story of our country, the three of them made sense to me as a way of looking at those shifts.
Both of these characters that you follow, they're dealing with addiction issues. There's very precarious living situations, struggling with housing insecurity. Both of them seem to have been in prison from quite a young age. And also, I think, interestingly, both of them seem to be victims of crime themselves. And I suppose that gets us to this clash between perception versus reality. When you were following them through, Asher, was that something that you felt at that time that was quite different to the caricatures we see in the media?
Well, I think part of the advantage of taking the long view that you get in the Valley, following people's lives over the course of 18 months, is that it allows, I guess, a fuller picture of reality. There are all of these ways in which representations of criminal justice issues, and whether it's in news media or true crime or even crime fiction and so on, all of these sort of mystifications, I think, that stand between us and the reality of what's taking place in our society. And one of those is sort of inherent to the court process, and that's that court matters are dealt with one at a time. And so reporting on somebody's offending will tend to focus on just that offence in that short window of their life. And what we see in the Valley is a whole string of things, but a history leading right back to, as you say, imprisonment in teenage years, and a whole host of challenges and difficulties in their lives. But also, I think, to that point that you raised about them being the victims of crimes as well. When you're focusing on someone's offending, you don't necessarily get the picture of where they fit in, or in terms of their own history, the idea that they also have at times been victims of serious offending. And that's, I think, another, been a significant mystification or a construction of an idea of like a victim and offender as being two, the victims are over here and the offenders are over here, and they're two different camps. Whereas the reality in the Valley is much more murky. One day Nathan and Rikihana are offenders, and then the next day they're being offended against, which doesn't fit the tidy picture of good guys and bad guys, which is often what we get in the media.
Gabriella, I think that the dominant narrative that we get out there is one where violent crime is rampant, and then on the other hand you have successive governments that are soft on crime. What do you think that narrative gets wrong about the reality of the criminal justice system?
I think Asher's hit the nail on the head in terms of public misconceptions of crime in New Zealand, of law and order, and the ways in which those dynamics play up, right to the kind of fundamental level of this all being about the individual and the decisions that individuals make, to commit antisocial behaviour that is then criminalised. And sure, individuals end up in the system because they were investigated for offending, charged with an offence, and dealt with in the criminal courts accordingly. But obviously, the actions of individuals don't exist in this vacuum of pure free will. And I think from the mahi itself, it's so clear that there's context to everything. And in terms of like the work that we do as lawyers, good lawyering lawyering should be about drawing attention to that wider context, but also that's so limited when the context is deeply politicized. And the fact that people are captured by the criminal legal system because of a much deeper history of state policy decisions that, define crime, define how it is punished, and more importantly, create the conditions for antisocial behaviour to be criminalised and punished accordingly. So all of this, kind of tough on crime, soft on crime, rubbish that we hear in the media and, we hear being barked at by, by politicians who are, entrenching these systems. I think all of it reduces and minimizes the violence that exists at that state level and through these kind of systems of power and decision making. And it's very easy to draw attention to things at that microcosm in terms of individual actors, existing in a system. But there's so little attention drawn to the actual violence of the system itself.
One thing that stood out to me from reading The Valley about how these broader dynamics serve to push people into the criminal justice system is around the reasons why Rikihana and Nathan end up in prison at different times. I think people's perception of prison is primarily that you're sentenced to prison, right? That you've done something really bad and then the judge says you're off to prison. But as we see in this book, and as certainly I see in my practice as a lawyer as well, there's a huge portion of the prison population that hasn't been convicted of a crime. They're there on remand, which means they're waiting for their case to be heard. And that a big reason that they are in prison is because they have nowhere else to go or nowhere else they can go safely, where they are themselves safe and when they are not putting other people at risk. That reflects this broader social failing of a lack of housing or, a lack of employment, a lack of mental health support, a lack of addiction support. And, I think that also reflects a misconception about what prison is about. It's not just about punishing people. Currently, it exists also as essentially a holding pen for people who have nowhere else to go in a way. And I suppose, we often talk about criminal justice as if it is a discrete policy area, right? But as is clear from this book, you can't really separate it from these whole other sets of issues: housing, mental health, addiction, and poverty. And so actually that brings me to a comment that one of the reviewers of your book, Morgan Godfrey, made, where he described The Valley as an important contribution to our collective understanding of class society. And I was wondering, do you agree with that description of the book as being about class society? And if so, what do you mean by that?
Well, The Valley follows people going through the criminal justice system, but also it follows people working in the criminal justice system and, to an extent, life at home and at work and in the community alongside what's taking place in the courtroom and in prison. And we followed Rikihana to the WINS office and to the Salvation Army food bank, and Nathan to the places that he goes, hospital and rehab and so on. And so in that sense, The Valley is something like a social history of life in the criminal justice system in the early 2020s. And life in the criminal justice system is characterized by class. And most obviously, at the end of the day, the lawyers go home to live in a different part of town, generally speaking, and they live in accommodation that they rent, and the judges go and live in accommodation that they own. And Nathan and Rikihana are either homeless or living with family or between, precarious accommodation or in prison. And so at the very base, there's kind of these very hefty material factors that distinguish the different lives of the people in the book are the kind of things that are almost so obvious that they get overlooked in the discussion of the criminal justice system, but these are of crucial importance to what actually takes place. And so, to just take the example of the two main figures in the book, Nathan has his mother's place that he's often able to use as a bail address, and Rikihana doesn't have that available to him. And so will often end up remanded in custody and in prison because there's not a suitable address available to him.
It reminds me of a comment that Rob Campbell made on a recent episode of Undercurrents when we were talking about the health system. And he said, well, not only do we have a two-tier health system, we've got a two-tier education system, we've got a two-tier housing system, we've got a two-tier everything else. And for some reason, the same people seem to end up on one side of the line every time. And I think what we see in the Valley is a clear example of how the criminal justice system is yet another one of those ways in which people are sorted.
And it manifests itself in quite explicit ways, just in terms of like the actual architecture of criminal law. In the example that you've pointed out in terms of, whether bail applications are granted based on appropriate housing is one of the greatest travesties that, strikes the heart of the criminal legal system's supposed cornerstone of the presumption of innocence and, the right to not be unlawfully or arbitrarily detained. But because of, state abandonment policies and the fact that, so many people going through that system, come from precarious lives, it means that, so much state violence in terms of incarceration is just allowed to take hold of this country's justice system, and even down to sentencing itself. Something that I've been thinking about, and I'm not too sure if the book directly talks to this, but the whole legal test for discharges without convictions and name suppression as well. Like, these are all legal tests that are defined by supposed material consequences for people. But the way in which the law recognizes consequences is because of your class status. It's because of your proximity to wealth and power, and the ways in which consequences affect that. For example, if you've got employment, if you own a business, if you're able to pay for an expensive psychologist report to talk about the mental health implications of a conviction, like, these are all things that tangibly can make such a difference for people's outcomes in the criminal legal system.
So that's spot on, Gabriella. I think with discharges without conviction, if you're a young person and you've, say, you're in university, or maybe you've got a job lined up, that's the kind of concrete thing that the justice system can put its hook into and say, there you go, you're a good young lad. We don't want to see you held back by this. Whereas if you are someone who doesn't have the means to be in that position, it's almost as if what the system is saying is, well, you have no prospects to begin with, so there's no harm done by giving you a conviction anyway, which is a way, in essence, in which the poor and the well-off are treated differently by the criminal justice system. We can understand the system as being about class in two ways, I think. We can view the criminal justice system as symptomatic of class division in society, but also there are ways in which we can understand it as a tool of class society as well. And a really stark example of this recently seems to be the changes around move-on orders, right, where the criminal justice system is being deployed very explicitly to address what is a problem of poverty. I mean, Gabriella, I'm not sure if you had any reactions when you heard the news of the government's changes around the move-on orders.
Oh no, it's absolutely horrendous. And I think one of the most explicit sort of policies in demonstrating this current government's far-right intent, just in terms of how discardable they see, our houseless whānau out on the streets, and the widening of police powers in effectively discarding, the problems, the socioeconomic problems that this government has created because of its, social abandonment policies. It's a really clear example of the ways in which austerity and tough on crime policies go hand in hand, because it can kind of seem a little bit strange or nonsensical on the surface, right? Like, you have these, governments that come through and, talk about small state stuff, trying to be fiscally responsible, trying to minimize their involvement in in people's lives through, neoliberal ideology. But then when it comes to carceral policies, when it comes to policing and prisons, all of that gets ramped up to such an excessive degree that directly targets, the poor, targets working class communities, it targets Māori and Pacifica, through a racialized lens and so on. But I think that's a deliberate part of the economic design of neoliberalism and austerity, right? Because you leave people vulnerable, you strip away welfare protections, you create enormous, employment and housing precarity. And then the state is obviously left with this massive problem because people are in precarious positions. And so the way that it sweeps away that problem is through over-policing, it's through expanding our prisons, it's through all of these, extra carceral policy measures. And I mean, the move on order legislation, the imagery of it is so literal in the sense that it is literally the government sweeping away its houseless problem that it's created, over generations of social abandonment.
Asher, I'm keen to hear from you about this relationship between the rise of penal populism and the broader economic transformations that have taken place in this country. But perhaps to help us to set the scene for that, could you just actually explain a bit about what the rise of penal populism is and what came before that?
So penal populism is the idea, it describes the policy shift that took place, I guess, from the mid to late 20th century, where the criminal justice system, like many parts of the state and the welfare state, was essentially governed almost sort of consensually by elites of one kind or another. Senior public servants and judges and lawyers and so on largely had control of the criminal justice system and was set about implementing a policy agenda that, I guess, reflected the attitudes which they held as a group, and their own vision of common sense and so on. And what that looked like in New Zealand was by no means sort of a perfect system. But for instance, the prison population was very significantly lower. Prison sentences were a lot shorter, and rehabilitative activities in fact existed. And life in the criminal justice system was different. In the 80s and 90s, there are a number of political and technological changes. I suppose it's a chicken and egg question. What is the cause of it? But happening alongside what Gabriella is describing in terms of the state abandonment policies, the dismantling of the welfare state, the ending of family benefits, and the winding down of social housing, the removal of trade barriers and so on, and the dismantling of industry and employment in New Zealand. There are social crises that arise out of those policies that call out for some kind of response. And there has been a concerted strategy to meet those social problems with a criminal justice response. A big part of the process of penal populism is also the news media and the commercialization of news media in that same period of time, resulting in a lot more crime coverage, a lot more politicized crime coverage, and the emergence of lobbying groups directed towards using crime stories to advocate for increasingly punitive and restrictive criminal justice measures. And so the consequence of that has been the escalation of sentence lengths, the increase in the use of pretrial detention, and all of these various other changes to the criminal justice system, which has resulted in massive growth in the prison population and the number of people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. It's interesting that Gabriella talks about the imagery and sort of the theatrics of the move on order, in the sense that there's almost this acceptance that yes, it's futile, or it's almost it's almost vaguely ridiculous because where is someone to be moved on to? But in this way, it fits in to the long-standing, almost kind of theatrical, narrative-driven cycle of law and order, moral panic, and legislative response that goes back, decades now. And to start in the 90s, there was the notion that there was a spate of home invasions which were taking place, and so there was a new nomenclature developed for that kind of aggravated burglary. And as a result of that, there was a referendum and agitation around the referendum, which was directed towards putting pressure on politicians to increase sentence lengths and make prison conditions more harsh. And then in the 2000s, there was the spectre of meth-related crime and all of the changes to the Misuse of Drugs Act and the new Sentencing Act and parole laws and so on, which have been a big factor in the increase of the prison population. In the next decade, there's another one. And the next decade, it's offending while on bail. And that gives rise to the bail law reforms, the reversal of the onus for people who are facing, who have significant criminal histories. And that is one of the biggest drivers of the prison population, is there's a massive growth in the remand population between the 2010s and present. And then most recently under the last government, it was ram raids. And now it's antisocial behaviour on the street and move on orders. So in each of these cases, you have a situation which is representative of a social crisis which is taking place in the community, and a reinterpretation of that as the actions of individuals which needs to be met with punishment rather than a reflection of the changing material conditions and the consequences of that in people's lives. Whether it's the prevalence of the burglaries, or it's people turning to drugs, or it's people offending while on bail, or most recently people who are without houses and living on the street.
I think using the term theatrics is incredibly helpful. I mean, in part also because we all know that these tough on crime policies, they don't work, and I'm not sure that anyone actually thinks they do. The idea of increasing sentences as a deterrent on crime, that presupposes that people are out there and they're about to shoplift from the supermarket, and they're like, oh, well, the maximum penalty for shoplifting has gone up by 3 months. Is it now worth my while? Like, that's not the way any of this happens at all. And in that sense, tough on crime politics is a really clear case of right-wing virtue signalling, right? It's primarily this moral condemnation rather than any kind of attempt to actually address the drivers of crime or the drivers of antisocial behaviour. And Gabriella, earlier you pointed out the tension with the broader program of this government, where there's this real focus on delivery, on targets, but it's all just the performance of being a good CEO.
No, absolutely. And I mean, to the state, it's all theatrics. But to real people going through the system, it's incredibly destructive. But there is something that is so pointedly ridiculous about a lot of these policies. And I think in particular to the whole the gang patch ban being, I don't know, just one of the most ridiculous examples of right-wing virtue signalling. But then also there was also that example with the cap that they put on sentencing discounts that were available to the courts.
One of the main strategies of the law and order lobby is to try to reduce the level of discretion and autonomy of people working in the justice sector to make decisions that meet the justice of the case. And so that's the design of 3 strikes and the bail law reforms. And what these things do is, in the short term, it's very cheap, because as expensive as parliamentary hours are, they're cheap compared to delivering actual material things in people's lives. So legislation is to some extent sort of for free for the government, and it's able to get a quick hit out of escalating law and order policies by passing a new bill. But what's happening is it's writing a big check for a future government in terms of meeting the costs in the prison system, but also it's writing a big check for the communities who bear the consequences of disrupted lives as people get caught up in the criminal justice system, and the long-term consequences for people of being incarcerated at a young age and exposed to the things that happen to people in those settings. So there's this way in which, like many of these issues, almost like climate change in a way, the consequences are felt privately by the people who are the victims of these policies, and the benefits accrue to those who are able to use them to beat the drum.
That gets us to the question of who benefits from law and order politics. If these tough on crime policies don't work at the end of the day in terms of making communities safer, why does the right lean into them, and who benefits from that?
When you take all of this back to the social abandonment policies of Rogernomics, neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s, the destruction of the welfare state, the restructuring of industries, the privatizing of state assets, the stripping away of workers' protections, and the precarity that created for the working class in Aotearoa in particular, disproportionately felt by Māori and Pacifica, where all of these, these extracarceral measures were used to effectively sweep away, the rising social problems of poverty, of housing precarity, of so-called, antisocial behaviour that was, being driven by the economic chaos that the government was causing. I mean, who was fundamentally benefiting from all of those policies? Again, it's the corporate class. And it might not seem so closely related, and I think how Asher has pointed it out in terms of the ways in which, these policies are mapped across our communities in quite visible and intimate ways is true. But all of this furthermore kind of exists at that wider political level of who fundamentally benefits from, capitalism's effective class war on working class communities in New Zealand, and the ways in which tough on crime policies have effectively driven, the growing inequality.
Just to echo something that Gabriella said before, I think to answer this question about like who benefits and how it works politically, a law and order approach to social crisis is about the individualization of responsibility for problems which are the consequence of political decisions, instead of pointing the finger at deteriorating material circumstances as the causes of social dysfunction that happens in our communities, to point at those of us who are the victims of these policies and who've borne the greatest consequences of these policies, people who've been incarcerated and have suffered the kind of social harm that results from that. Towards the end of the book, in the epilogue, I talk about the similarities between Nathan and Rikihana, and the similarities between them and many of the men who are in prison in New Zealand. And the commonalities are stark, so that, nearly 2/3 of the adult male prison population has suffered a traumatic brain injury. Basically, essentially brain damage of a kind from being hit in the head, that can affect your decision making and impulsiveness, and has obvious relevance for recidivist offending. The rate of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in the prison population is estimated to be up to a quarter, which is something which can have similar consequences for decision making. Mental health issues, substance abuse issues, unemployment and a lack of access to training and work, and all of these things, these very hefty material things which are in common between people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, and are such big drivers of the frustrating inability of Nathan and Rikihana in the book to extricate themselves from these circumstances, are ultimately things which are outside of their control, and it's something which has been on rails in the society in which they grew up. does anybody choose to be in the car accident and have the head injury? Does anybody choose to be beaten up and likewise have a head injury, a life-changing head injury, or to suffer any of these other events which might derail one's life, like being incarcerated at a relatively young age? So I think that's the fundamental political dynamic, is a mystification and a redirection from the collective political responsibility towards individual responsibility.
We know that Māori are hugely overrepresented in the criminal justice system, especially in recent years in light of movements like Black Lives Matter in the United States. Often we look to the idea of racism for understanding part of the differential treatment that Māori and Pākehā might experience, or Māori versus Pākehā might experience in the criminal justice system. But Gabrielle, I'm interested in your view. Is racism a helpful way of understanding what's going on here, or is that potentially too narrow of a framing?
I don't think it's too narrow of a framing. I think it's important to situate the conversation about race within systems and an understanding of colonial power, of capitalist power, and the ways in which race, as this kind of, pseudo-scientific classification of peoples has been used as a way to, fundamentally shape a more unequal society. And obviously the criminal justice system has deployed race in a way that has enabled colonisation to continue to reproduce itself, going from like the early days of land dispossession. I mean, the New Zealand police force has its origins in the New Zealand Armed Constabulary, and how that was, set up as a crown militia to, roll out the very first, framings of criminality against Indigenous people for our resistance to early colonial violence. And 150 so years later, the criminal justice system, or I shouldn't even call it the criminal justice system, I'm falling into the old school language traps, but the criminal legal system and incarceration, mass incarceration in particular, is the most powerful and destructive force of enduring colonisation amongst our communities, because of how it breaks apart whānau, because of how it keeps us materially dispossessed, how it keeps us traumatised. So yeah, kind of understanding race in the context of capitalism and colonisation and in the history of those systems in New Zealand is definitely not a reduction at all. I think it's quite a helpful tool for understanding how things work at an ideological level, both in terms of the fallacy of those ideologies and just how, bullshit it all is, but the material repercussions for our communities, seen through the outcomes of the criminal legal system for our people.
Yeah, I think our analysis of the criminal justice system has to account for that, and an understanding of its historical relationship to class and the material forces in society, and colonization and that historical process is a big part of that, while at the same time recognizing that there are also commonalities between the criminal justice system and the prison system in colonial and in non-colonial countries, and the role of these institutions in class society. And in New Zealand, class is racialized by the historical process of colonization and dispossession of resources, and then in the neoliberal era, the attacks on New Zealand industries and industries in which Māori workers were highly represented and so on, meant that the dismantling of, for instance, trade protections and the massive growth of unemployment which took place in the 80s fell. The rate of Māori unemployment went up 25%, while general unemployment went up only 10%. And that's what I mean when I say that in New Zealand, class is racialized. And so when you have a a system like the criminal justice system, which is part of class society, the disproportionate representations of different ethnic groups in the working class will be reflected in the way in which that system operates. It's something which has been studied on and off in New Zealand, and there was a large study undertaken in using police data not long ago, and it found that your chance of being charged with an offence is 11% higher if you're Māori rather than Pākehā, and that's just being charged with an offence that doesn't take into account all of the other decisions that might take place along the way, and how those decisions might be made differently depending on a person's ethnicity. But also the very hefty material realities, like just to take fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, if you suffer from that condition, you're 19 times more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. Or there are the differences between Nathan and Rikihana, and Nathan's Pākehā and Rikihana is Māori, and that will undoubtedly have figured in Rikihana's experience of the criminal justice system. But our analysis also has to account for the life course of Nathan and his place in the criminal justice system too, as a person who suffers from many of the same kind of very fundamental material disadvantages that Rikihana suffers from, and the things which they have in common, which reflect the accumulated social wreckage suffered by people who are in that part of the community where the social abandonment policies have bitten, and that affects most of the people who are in the prison population or who are caught up in the criminal justice system.
That's a really important way of understanding all of this in terms of race, right? Because, all the statistics show that Māori are more likely to be, given a prison sentence, more likely to be charged with offending. There's this kind of conception, right? And it is true that that's because of bias. It's because of the public perception, or the perception that police, that judges have of our people when they enter into the courtroom. But I think the problem with focusing on issues of racial bias and racial perception within the criminal legal system is that it kind of gives the criminal legal system a bit of a hall pass in terms of, well, surely this is an issue that we can rectify by just training our people up on addressing their biases and schooling them better on, anti-racism and, trying to be a bit more mindful of that, opposed to the ways in which class, particularly, and systems of colonisation and capitalism seep in to these experiences. Because the story of, the criminal legal system, the story of policing, the story of prisons in New Zealand is the story of colonisation. And I think being able to kind of understand things in terms of the systems, it means that we can't simply address these issues from a reformist lens, from carrying out more anti-racist workshops, within the criminal legal system space, but it's actually about addressing things from that kind of fundamental systemic level, which, I don't know, we'll get into this a little bit later on in the conversation, but that's what abolitionist theory is about compared to, reformist discussions around the criminal legal system. It's about actually asking those larger systemic questions of why are our people in the system? Why is crime framed in this way? Why are people, punished accordingly? And, it's not just about the system failing our people, but the system operating in this quite deliberate way by design to uphold colonial capitalist power in New Zealand and to keep that power firmly entrenched.
Well, I think now is the time for us to be talking a bit about what the way forward is here. I'm sure there'll be many people, Asher, who read The Valley who take away from it, a number of specific changes that could be made to our laws, reforms. I can think of many that would be helpful, but if we're understanding these problems as being systemic, which is to say interconnected with all of these other issues to do with how our economy is structured and how power is held, what does that tell us about where we should be directing our efforts, Asher, in terms of turning around some of these issues?
Yeah, well, I don't think anybody could help after reading The Valley not having some ideas about things that might be different in terms of charging decisions or the bail laws or any of these kind of things, but also the broader sweep of what takes place in Nathan and Rikihana's life over those 18 months. The larger patterns, I think, point to the role of those hefty material realities and driving their involvement and continued involvement in the criminal justice system. I think there's kind of a related dynamic to what Gabriella was talking about before in the way that the critique of the system for instance, racial disparity, equally the critique of the system for injustice in terms of some of its particular rules, can almost be reincorporated by the system in the process of the, reformist discourse. And I think that's probably using a slightly overly technical term for it. What I mean is that we can get distracted by the idea that certain reforms or adjustments to the laws will make a big difference to what's happening here. And it's something which lawyers are often attracted to because we're so rules oriented and so on, and so capable of arguing every side of the point that we will see an argument for why a rule should be one way or the other. But if nothing changes in terms of those larger historical, political and policy forces that are shaping people's lives, then no amount of changes to the sentencing or bail laws is going to really move the needle on what's happening in the criminal justice system. I wouldn't want to be taken to be saying that none of that stuff should change. I think certainly there should be more discretion for judges and so on to be taking the decision that seems just in the particular case. But I think that can work as a bit of a misdirection. The other thing that appeals about policy reform is that it's in a way maybe seen as a shortcut around political problems that are too big and too hard. And I think in some ways, the disappointing news that I take away from the Valley is that there are no quick fixes to this, that there are the old and hard political problems of who gets what and the distribution of resources. And those are very politically difficult to resolve. And that might be dispiriting and drive some of the interest in looking for technical fixes and these kind of ways around the problem, if only we can sort of get our way out of it by fixing the criminal justice system. And I don't think that there is a way of fixing it. It is separate to its connection to other parts of society. It's not apart from the rest of social life and the state and the distribution of resources in our country.
When we start thinking of this as a political problem, related to that, I think there is like a crisis of legitimacy with the criminal justice system. And by that I mean that on one level it doesn't matter too much specifically what way the system responds to crime, whether or not a sentence of 1 year imprisonment is good or community work. At the end of the day, it matters only to the extent that is seen by the community affected as a just outcome. At the moment, it seems like nobody is happy with the criminal justice system in the sense that the right has the view that the criminal justice system is too weak, it's too soft on crime. Those who are more progressive feel that the system is unjust in the various ways that we've talked about today. And I feel like so much of this comes from the fact that we started this episode on, which is there is this real misunderstanding about even the current day-to-day reality. And I mean, I'm always struck when I'm reading old newspapers from the 19th century by how, everything was in there. Like everyone that went into court charged with shoplifting, their name would be in the paper and exactly what happened to them was in the paper. And that reflected, I think, this, proximity to the system that people had back then, whereas now hardly anyone ever sets foot in a courtroom unless you're there as a defendant or as a professional. And that has contributed to this misunderstanding and therefore this crisis of legitimacy. But the point is not that there is one particular direction that it has to be going, but that it has to be something that is seen by the people affected as just.
There's a certain level of social harm and wrongs that people do one another that's essentially trans-historical. It would happen in any place and any time. The difficulty of living with other people and the way that people act out and hurt one another's. That does bring us on, I think, to some of the kind of conceptual issues to do with the criminal justice system. And I think you see a clash between a system that has its origins, and if we go back to if we read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, the kind of mad punishments that were done in the monarch's name in the early development of this kind of social order. The criminal justice system predates the logic of the modern state and the welfare state and the idea of reform and sort of humanist and improvement and the idea of progress even. And I think we now run into this time where there's a criminal justice system that arrives out of history like that, and it's coming into contact with expectations of a modern state, which is that it be effective, for instance. Solution, that there is a way to rearrange the criminal justice system in a way which will make it work. And I think that's fundamentally at odds with where it comes from, and also out of step with people's moral intuition about social harm. And any kind of social order has a process for resolving or responding to social harm, and that will be ultimately arbitrary. It's a moral question, and what's right in a particular cultural context to rebalance after the social order has been disrupted by some kind of social harm. And so I think there needs to be an understanding that is fundamentally not a technical matter. The prison, it's pretty established as a normal method now, but its emergence in history was as a kind of scientific punishment in a way, like the idea that you could measure out time and quantify the level of harm in a social act and meet it with a certain amount of imprisonment and so on is like an idea that's specific to that Enlightenment period of developing the technologies of the state, and it's at odds with the basic moral reality of finding a justice response to social harm. So I think there's that conflict which is playing out in the criminal justice system at the moment between the demands of bureaucratic managerialism around performing and meeting targets and delivering outputs and so on, which is the logic of the modern state, and the social function of a justice system, which is to resolve social harm and reestablish some kind of balance. I think with the crisis of legitimacy is that it's not really able to do either of these things very well. And there's not a lot of freedom of movement for the decision makers inside the system around meeting those competing demands. And so I think as a result of that, you see the emergence of things like the therapeutic courts and these attempts by groups inside the criminal justice system to try to reform it. But the limits of those institutions and the fact that the courts and the judges don't have control of resources in any serious way are quickly felt in those institutions when they run into the fundamental lack of resources in other parts of the state, in the health system and the housing system and in education and work. And that in turn creates a potential crisis of legitimacy for those attempts as well.
It's really interesting because I've only just started this whole journey working as a criminal defense lawyer. I didn't even think I would end up practicing just because of my cynicism around the law and the fundamental kind of elephant in the room, which is that, all of these laws were birthed from colonialism itself. So, but anyway, kind of operating in the system, I think it's interesting the work that you can do on like a deeply human level, working with people who are going through some of the worst crises of their lives, and that's why they end up, in this situation before the courts, and the courts are, supposedly there to deal with the or address the impossible task of resolving that crisis when that crisis, draws from so many layers, as Asher has pointed out. And it's not just layers in terms of people's own stories and their experiences within their whānau, but, this is fundamentally the story of a nation and generations of state abandonment policies that, you're supposed to address. And, and it always feels quite sacred, like working with people through all of that, and just, being there to kind of see them beyond the statistics, beyond the offending that they're called to court for. But even doing, the Mahia's defence lawyers, the work that we do fundamentally individualises these wider societal problems, and working with people, as individuals, or not even just as individuals, but, working with community, with whānau in that context, I think will forever be limited unless we're able to deal with those truly wider societal questions and forces at play. And that's a very imaginative project, but it's one that's fundamentally necessary if we're ever wanting to see true justice.
That gets right back to, what we were talking about at the beginning when you said, Gabriella, the way in which a law and order approach fundamentally individualizes these long-running historical forces, and as individuals working in the system, there's the ethical dimension in the way that we relate to people and how we best serve people, but also an acceptance that in many ways we are powerless as individuals in our professional capacity, in the role to alter those things, and that the true resolution of these conflicts takes place politically and collectively. And so, we might be able to acquit ourselves well in how we serve others as lawyers, but that will never be enough for, as you say, true justice.
That's all we've got time for. Thanks, Asher and Gabriella, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Ollie.
You've been listening to an episode of Undercurrents, brought to you by Public Interest. Theme music by Ben Locke. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more conversations making sense of politics and power in Aotearoa, please consider supporting us at publicinterest.nz. We'll see you next time.